Welcome to the new Podovirus podcast, which we kind of started to give ourselves another channel to talk to the phage community. I've been wanting to have conversations with key phage people, and I like to do that in a conversation rather than always interviewing them on a blog or things like that, or just through email. So I'm glad that I could have convinced you, Joe, to talk to me about your career, because I think it's a really special turning point that you have been an NIH program officer, kind of overseeing all of our phage work for so long. And I was hoping we could talk about your reflections on your career and the phage field and what you kind of see where we're at, and maybe we'll get into some wisdom. But I think we should just take this where it goes. It's always fun to talk to you. And this is kind of a new experiment with the podcast. So let's just record the conversation.
Great.
So maybe I'll pass it to you and you could just give an intro to those who haven't been following your role in the phage field so far.
All right. I was a bench scientist for a large portion of my professional career, and then I left to start doing program stuff. It was around 2008, and I came to NIAID in 2011, and the phage stuff really started 3 or 4 years after that. As some of you may know, there was an outbreak of antibiotic resistance Klebsiella at the NIH Clinical Center, and one of my program colleagues, Jane Knisely, was contacted by someone in the clinical center about whether we in program could help find phages to kill the Klebsiella outbreak strain in the NIH. Jane started a bacteriophage interest group, and then I took over, I think around 2015. And at that time, we were doing several things. We had a bacteriophage interest group, which started out as just NIAID people. And then we started adding FDA people. And as some of you may know, we had a few workshops. We had a NIAID FDA workshop in 2015 and 2017, and we had one in 2021. And we started having speakers come in just to speak to us in person. And then when COVID happened, we started inviting people from around the country and then eventually around the world to speak remotely, and it sort of grew into a bigger and bigger thing. And I was fortunate to be there at an exciting time, and people seemed to enjoy the seminar series. And of course, NIAID was doing various things through grants and contracts to support the development of phage therapy. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to various phage futures and phage summit conferences. I think that's where I first met you, was at the phage futures. And then so I just sort of ended up getting, networking with more and more people. And then at the beginning of this year, at the end of January, I decided I would leave NIAID, and I am now consulting for a couple of companies, and I'm working with Phage Canada, which is led by Greg German and others out of Toronto. Keeping busy, and I just got back from the viruses and microbes in Australia, which was fun and interesting. And that's sort of my phage life, phage therapy life in a nutshell.
Yeah, awesome. So you haven't, it sounds, actually retired, because now you have a bunch of different new jobs.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I was excited to be able to, with a little bit of picking and choosing what I did and didn't want to do. And so that's been exciting. Working with the companies was exciting. And I think, Phage Canada is trying to get sort of towards the place where Phage Australia maybe is already. So we'll see what happens. And I'm happy to be helping with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've been just looking back on even when we started Phage Directory, and I think we talked to you early on at one of those Phage meetings, and I was hearing a lot around the time that NIH won't fund phage therapy, and everyone was passing around their failed grant proposals, and it was like they just a red line through it saying phage, this won't work. And I just, do you feel like that was how it felt for you on your end? Like, was there a period where it was kind of like hard for anyone to get phage funding or for NIAID to take it seriously? Or was that kind of just the impression maybe that people had
I think
out
it was a
here?
little bit of both. I mean, I think partly, I mean, it was around that time when NIAD, and again, I'll give credit to Jane, she sort of spearheaded, Jane Knisely sort of spearheaded the effort to put out that, if you remember, a phage-specific call for grants. And I think that makes a big difference because when people apply for phage therapy grants, certainly, I mean, it's gotten better, I imagine, but when people are competing with other modalities of treating AMR infections, there is a large bias against sort of a skepticism towards that approach. That was one of the reasons we felt like we needed to put out an initiative that was only for phage grants. So the phage grants would be competing with other phage grants, and we'd have a study section. The composition of the study section would be phage people who wouldn't hopefully cut some of the biases against their own.
Yeah.
That the people who, you know, I mean, we can talk about how fair or unfair the reputation in the West about phage therapy in the East and how that influenced the way study sections reacted to it. So, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say that NIAID was against it. It's just that it's sort of, if you don't put out grants that will be reviewed by people who are in the phage field, and you're sort of taking all comers in the AMR, especially five or 10 years ago, you were going to get that result, that people were going to say phage, we're more comfortable with, you know, small molecule approaches. And so I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but I didn't perceive that we felt that, but I think Jane and I the R21 was sort of an idea that I forget, I'm probably not giving someone else credit who deserves it. But Jane and I talked about that. You know, one of the things that people at the NIH talk about, you know, the reasons for having a call for a specific kind of grant is A, we really want that, which was true in phage. And the other thing is that if we feel that an approach, I mean, you could make the argument that, well, okay, phage is another approach to treating AMR, and you can just make a broad call for AMR approaches, and phage is good to go in there. But then when you start looking and you're seeing what you were saying the field was seeing, that the grants were not getting reviewed, probably weren't getting a fair shake, because the majority of the study section were people who weren't as familiar with this and maybe had these biases, thinking that phage therapy wasn't as rigorous as other therapies. And that's when NIAID will act to counteract that by putting out a call for a bunch of grants just specifically on phage that will be reviewed by a study section comprised to be experts to review phage grants, rather than a study section comprised of people who are experts in, you know, all areas of AMR, but actually probably most of those people were not comfortable with phage. We certainly, at least, were consciously saying we don't want phage approaches. Yeah. And in fact, to the contrary, I think we were noticing that phage's grants weren't doing as well as we would like them to do, and therefore we took action.
Got it.
The other thing that I will say, you know, R21s technically don't require preliminary data. And so often if you're trying to sort of help a field get going, you put out a call for R21s, and those are smaller grants, but the bar isn't quite as high to get them, and then people hopefully can get enough accomplished with their R21 that then they have the preliminary data to be more competitive when they go for an R01. So that's another factor that probably made the phage grants perhaps a little bit less competitive, is that some of the small molecule things maybe were more likely to have really robust preliminary data. And so by having a call for R21s that were going to be reviewed by phage-specific study sections, we solved a couple of problems. One was giving the phage people a fair shake, because they were being reviewed by a panel of phage people, and they were only being compared to other phage grants. And the other thing was that hopefully the data that was generated by those R21s would allow people to be more competitive for us.
Do you feel like that the outcome of that R21, like when you think about the grants that were funded or the groups that were funded, like, have you seen them go on to get R1s and like continue building?
You were going to ask that question. As I was saying that, like, crap, and I don't have the ability to look at that anymore because I don't have the data the way I would have when I was still at NIAID. So that would be something. I mean, I guess I'll turn the question on you. Do you have a sense that people don't feel that it's as hard to get phage grants as they did at the time you were talking about?
Yeah, good question. I think I don't have the same sense anymore, that they're feeling like it's a red stamp and thrown out at all. People have shifted in what they're talking about, and it's about the specifics, like, when we put in this grant, will we collaborate with this group or not? Like the conversation seems to have advanced, and it's no longer, will the NIH ever consider phage therapy? I certainly don't hear that from.
Yeah. And I mean, I know people have even gotten phage therapy grant in other IC, like, for treatment of specific infections, heart or kidney, that were being funded by the institute that was interested in hearts or kidneys.
Okay.
So it wasn't just the NIAID that was funding phage therapy grants. Yeah, I think it's
kind of shifted. Do you feel like when you and Jane were kind of, I assume you have to pitch this idea to whoever internally, like, did you have to make a case for sending out the R21 at that point, like this first phage-specific call? Like, was that hard for you guys to get through, or could you kind of say, this is what we think, and everybody kind of agreed and backed you on that?
Well, I mean, and I think Jane did most of the heavy lifting on this. Jane and I talked about it, and Jane had to present it to our division. At about that time, NIAID was coming up with plans to how we're going to deal with AMR, and phage would be one of, I think, 6 or 7 things that would get mentioned in there. So it's a lot easier to convince people if the Institute has published a document saying, this is one of the approaches we think is a good one. When you're trying to argue that we should set aside money for a specific kind of grants, one of the first questions you're asked are, how does it fit in with the NIAID mission statement? And when you have a document of how NIAID thinks we should deal with AMR and phage is included in it, that's at least half the battle.
Got it. Okay. So you kind of were able to just tie it back to that, and it was just kind of straightforward from that.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a really great awareness among NIAID leadership of how serious the AMR threat is.
Yeah.
And how much we need to not ignore any possible route of treatment, whether it be some novel class of traditional antibiotics or license or phages, or for C. diff, people are doing fecal microbiome transplants. We're reaching a point where AMR is enough of a crisis that we can't leave stones unturned.
Yeah.
It's never a good idea to leave stones unturned, but really now we're at a point where we've got a lot of momentum from the Patterson case, certainly, and some of the other capacity use cases, but the Patterson case really, of course, got kind of the book, and it was a very dramatic case.
Yeah, it's what launched us too. Just kind of rode that wave.
And I do think, having Stephanie Stratby and Chip Schooley, Stephanie, of course, is Tom's wife, and Chip is a friend of Tom and Stephanie's, and for lack of a better term, they had street cred in the ID world, so that helped overcome some of the, Chip and Stephanie, but, Chip, for a great part, understands how the ID world thinks, and they both do. And just having someone who had a big reputation, two people, Lily, who had a big reputation in the AIDS community, being involved in it just made a huge difference, I would say.
Yeah. I want to ask you, kind of coming back to what you were saying about Phage Canada, Phage Australia, how do you, the idea of these phage therapy centers, which I've been loosely calling them, versus people that are pursuing approaches just like as a biotech company, the more traditional approach. Do you see a role for both, or are you trying to coax centers to kind of pick a product and take it through clinical trials and advance it that way? Or how are you thinking about the...
I was actually, before the Thursday meeting, I was at a meeting with Gates, was talking about phage therapy, so we'll see what, if anything, they do. But, and I've often thought about this. This is a long way of answering your question, but, let's say instead of a phage cocktail, Tom Patterson had been treated by a very narrow spectrum pill. I don't know that would be approved either. So I don't know if it's phage. And I guess the point I'm making here is that I think they can hopefully work together. And by that, I mean, I think companies will do clinical trials, hopefully, that will show efficacy for things like recurring UTI infections and CF patients, things where people are infected, but it's not, so immediately life-saving, threatening as it was with, say, Tom. So those things will hopefully provide rigorous clinical data that at least some phages work. Where I think Phage Canada and Phage Australia and other organizations like that will always have a role, because the reason I was talking about Tom, if it had been a pill, it still wouldn't be approved, because there are going to be cases you can't really do a clinical trial for someone like in Tom's situation. And I think there's always going to be people like that, unfortunately. My hope would be that governments, that like people like John Iredale at Phage Australia, and Greg German at Phage Canada can hopefully get even more support from the government for their centers if clinical trials, admittedly with different phages, show efficacy, which would strengthen the argument that government should pay for this, even though the phages that are being developed in those countries haven't had, specifically those phages haven't had the clinical data. It will be interesting to see how that plays out. But my sense is that John Iredale at Phage Australia, and you probably would know better than I, but I think he's been able to convince the Australian government to spend a certain amount of money on this. Mm-hmm. And Greg German at Phage Canada has been able to do the same thing. So, I guess what will move the needle? And will clinical data that, traditional clinical trial data that phages work in other situations with different phages move the needle, given that it's hard to imagine a clinical trial happening for a lot of the cases that are treated by Phage Australia, because it wouldn't be ethical. And, I guess with traditional antibiotics, which were broad spectrum, but of course that was a double-edged sword. But I guess the plus side of the good side of the double-edged sword was that if it was approved for one indication, a doctor could prescribe the exact same pill off label.
Oh.
Whereas if, you have E. coli, UTI clinical trial data, well, I guess there's also possibility that those phages that are clinically tried will look like they're appropriate for someone who's in an emergency situation. You can prescribe those same phages off label, but I think it's more likely given the narrow spectrum of phages, which of course has a lot of, it spares the microbiome and it has a lot of advantages. But one of the things that makes it more complicated is that, you're not going to be using the same phages that were shown to work in a clinical trial.
Yeah.
The way you do with the medicinal.
Got it.
That makes, in my view, it's a challenge. But, I think people. So I guess in the long run, I think it's unlikely that companies are going to ever do what Phage Australia and Phage Canada are doing in some of the countries that Toby Nabel works with, African nations and Asian nations that Toby works with, are trying to do, because there isn't really a route to clinical efficacy, which is, if you're trying to run a company, it's hard to keep the company going if you don't have that. So I guess, no, I wouldn't try to convince Phage Canada and Phage Australia to go in the routes that the companies already are, because I think, hopefully, if their government supports them, they can continue to do that. Well, and I mean, obviously, there are people, the European phage centers, and the Belgian group will hopefully also be good for that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. There's so many places I want to take this. But first of all, do you see some kind of, what is the U.S. going to do to fill that sort of niche, if we consider that Phage Australia, Phage Canada can get their governments on board to sort of subsidize personalized phage treatments for the patients that don't fit whatever products end up getting through. But it feels like the U.S. is never going to have the same context, given like the healthcare system being completely different. Like, do you still think that there's room for these kind of phage therapy centers, and could they be privately run or run as nonprofits, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question for the U.S. And as you say, socialized medicine, but getting closer to single payer, it seems, and I must say I don't know exactly how the Canadian and Australian medical systems work. My impression is certainly more socialized than the U.S. So I guess the question is whether the U.S., because the U.S. military has been interested in this for wound therapy, and I don't know if that's going to be a practical way. Some of the people that you're probably well aware of who are treating a lot of people with compassionate use in the U.S. are thinking about trying to develop that ability at their centers or in collaboration with other centers around the country. Getting the investment for that is going to be probably harder in the U.S. because of, as we said already, the way the healthcare system works.
Yeah.
And I don't, I mean, obviously, if some of the many clinical trials that we all know, hopefully we're going to start getting the reports from, and hopefully there'll be some positive signals that, that we'll have our first real rigorous controlled clinical trials that argue that phages, at least in some situations, worked. I mean, I would be a little surprised if none of those clinical trials show efficacy. I mean, I think we've learned some of the lessons from some of the earlier trials. Certainly, if you look at animal infection models, there's differences in use, but there's enough of them where phages clearly work that the idea that there is no place in humans, that humans are that different than than other mammals in terms of getting infected and having a phage treat them. I mean, certainly for traditional antibiotics, for years, efficacy in animal models has correlated quite well with efficacy in clinical settings. I mean, with humans. So the chances that phage are completely different in terms of the correlation between that seems not to be the most likely thing in the world.
Yeah. Actually, that makes me think, I wanted to ask you about the preclinical core, if that's what it was called, that I remember presenting about, that NIAID had, that you could kind of access preclinical models and almost like as a service through. Was that something you were running?
I mean, NIAID has and if you want, I can send you the link for it and put it up on your website, if that would be good. But, NIAID has a suite of what we called, because I'm no longer there, but what NIAID calls preclinical services. And, we in vitro testing, which we haven't really done that much for phage, but it's mostly for, testing the ability of antivirals, antifungals, and antibacterials to kill pathogens in the test tube. And then we have a suite of animal model things. And so to make this clear, in these situations, if a researcher has a product, they come to NIAID, and if NIAID decides that you have a good plan to develop your product, NIAID will pay a contractor to do the work for you. So, and what I used to talk about, what you were alluding to, is that we had, we had Pseudomonas mouse models that had been developed for testing traditional therapeutics. You could also test phages, and we did test phages for people in those models. And they're a good way of making go, no-go decisions and all that type of stuff. And I always would encourage people to talk to the people who ran those contracts. I mean, most of the antibacterial animal models were run by two terrific people, Aaron Zaituni and Erica Rotterdam, who are still at NIAID, and they did a fabulous job of running those contracts. And as part of running those contracts, they would talk to you about your development plan and which model might be the one that's most useful for you, because obviously they don't want to do testing that they don't think is going to help you develop your product, because that's a waste of the government's money.
So what do you think that phage developers or researchers, what do you wish they would do more of or do less of? From your vantage point, is there any kind of, when people ask you for your advice or messages that you think need to get out there, what do you like that you're seeing, and what are you kind of feeling like still isn't being addressed?
Well, when I consult with people, some of the advice I give has to do with how you write applications and stuff. I would say that one of the things that I always tell people is try to talk to the NIAID programmers, because they will give you advice as to how your study section is going to. They probably have been hearing that study section, and they know the biases of the study section. So I think, the NIAID program people really do want to help. A lot of the phage companies are really doing well to get to the point where they're doing what I think are reasonable clinical trials. And I guess, the challenge for them is going to be, hopefully, they've planned their business out so that if the trial is successful, they have a reasonable chance of actually making money with the product. And you all know about the QIAGEN and the company that developed an antibiotic and then went belly up a year or two later. So hopefully that fate won't meet them. But, and then I guess the question is, I think with the real challenge, and phage companies can't do that much about it. I mean, they can try to position themselves as well as they can, but it's a challenge for anyone who's trying to come up with a treatment for antibiotic-resistant infections. I'm not a medical economist, but everything tells me that it's a really lousy business model. Yeah. I mean, if someone develops a new cholesterol medicine, someone like me will be taking it hopefully for like 30 years every day. If you develop a new antibiotic, hopefully someone will take it 10 days and never need it again. So that you're not making nearly as much money. Not to mention the fact with traditional antibiotics that after a few years they become resistant and you can't use them anymore. So that's just, a challenge on top of the challenge. I guess that's not really saying what they should do. I mean, I think what will be useful is for people to, one of the discussions that happened at VOM was a discussion about getting more robust, reproducible in vitro assays. And, part of the discussion was Susan Lehman from FDA, and I think she had a really good point. Well, until we have clinical evidence that phages actually work, you really don't know which in vitro assays were predictive and which ones weren't, because we don't know which products became worked and which ones didn't. But, I think I don't know if companies should try to take this on themselves or whether NIAID should fund studies to do this. And NIAID did when I was there and still is doing this. I think if you compare traditional antibiotics to phage, there's a lot of stuff that happened in traditional antibiotics. I mean, there is the CLSI guidelines as to how you measure the minimum inhibitory concentration. And anyone who wants to develop a therapy better have a good reason if they want to go to the FDA, and they haven't done it by that. And, that sort of hopefully means that when Lab X is measuring an MIC and Lab Y is measuring an MIC, they're at least comparing apples to apples. Whereas, and I'm not saying that, I'm not, obviously everyone has the way they're used to doing it. But I would say that, the in vitro assays that, there's liquid assays, there's plate assays, there's this and that. And the other thing, as Susan Lehman pointed out, we don't know necessarily which one's going to be better because we don't know which phages are efficacious in a rigorous clinical trial. Australia says, well, ours worked in vitro and it worked in clinically, and Phage Canada says, well, yeah, the situation where it didn't work well. Is that because you didn't do the same in vitro assay, or is that because something else? And it's a little bit harder to know. So I think, one of the things, and that the recent NIAID council, Kyung Moon was talking about an initiative which will probably be out in October for grants to explore some of those issues. And also, what people in the antibiotic field call PKPD. And of course, the pharmacokinetics is more complicated in phage because hopefully they're replicating. So I think those are challenges for the field. If you're a company, it's at some level you have to worry about that when you're developing a product, because if you don't have those things controlled, you're probably less likely to have a successful clinical trial, which is bad. I guess at some level you have to take that on internally and come up with consistent things in your company so that you can make judgments on your own products. But, you wouldn't necessarily want to be the company that does this and so that everyone can benefit, because it's going to be expensive and complicated. So I don't know. I guess I don't have great immediate advice for companies. I think, a lot of the companies are doing what they should do. It's just, most of the companies that I'm involved with seem to know these things. I mean, it's not, a lot of them came from traditional, backgrounds.
Yeah. Well, on the note of this new grant that is going to be put out, I watched the recording that Kyung Moon kind of shared, and we've been looking at that grant and kind of how it seems like another phage-specific one, but also more of a center,
right? Like
a larger grant. When it comes to grants like that, do you think advantageous for groups to partner with multiple institutions, like say Taylor and Yale and Stanford all group together for one, instead of, putting in against each other 3 different ones? Like, how do you think about encouraging collaborations to get more expertise for these kind of center grants versus keeping it kind of more nimble and smaller and not kind of diluting across? I've been kind of wondering about that.
Yeah. Well, having said that, I think in getting just more people involved per se isn't what NIAID general. What they're looking for is if your group doesn't have a specific kind of expertise, that's when they really want them. I mean, if you're pairing with someone who is good at what you're good at, I don't think that helps you there.
Yeah.
Again, everybody else that's different. You would have to read the exact funding announcement. But broadly, I would say what they're looking for when they want, the reason they want you to collaborate is because you're really good at basic phage biology and you don't have as much strength in clinical matters. And the other people have strength in clinical stuff, but they don't have strength in basic phage biology. They want you to be able to have a team that, assemble a team that really can approach things from all the angles. What they don't really, they don't care to have two people that are part of the grant that are both expert phage biologists from two different institutions, because they don't think that really, hopefully you can convince them, if you're the phage biology experts, that your phage biology expertise is sufficient, and what you need is clinical trial expertise or something.
Yeah, I'm glad that that's the answer, because that makes the most sense to me. I've been trying to understand more about grant writing, but yeah, it seems like there's a lot of layers to understand just on the organizational side.
Yeah, and I guess, you have to sort of, I'll give you one example of, if you were trying to treat liver infections and try to apply to the appropriate institute that dealing with infections associated with liver transplants. Then you're going to get a bunch of people who are used to thinking about liver transplants. And I don't think that's the place to explain why your phage therapy is better than someone else's phage therapy.
Yeah.
Because what you're going to do is just point out to people that there are issues with phage therapy, and they already think there's issues. And that's the kind of thing where a program officer can help you. The place where you want to say your phage therapy is better than someone else's phage therapy is when there's a call for a bunch of phage grants.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to have phage experts who understand that there's issues, and they'll be impressed that yours is better. Assuming they agree with you that yours is better. But, you get the point. If you're back to applying to something where it's a broad call for things that can treat, about infections, and that's going to be covered by an institute that isn't NIAID, so it's going to be a study section that's not an expert in phage. The chances are even greater that the study section is going to have people that are biased against phage to start with.
Right.
So the last thing I want to do is make any comments about how that exists in phage treatments, because they already think that. That's interesting.
On the note of study sections, I was going to ask earlier when you mentioned how the program officers know their study section and know the kind of biases they might have. How long are study sections together and working together in one unit? Is that kind of like this study section is a year and that's the same people? Or do they know in advance at the point of releasing the grant RFA who the study section is going to be? So if you talk to the program officer, you could actually learn about the study section at that point.
Okay, so I'm not the best person. Having said, for the thing that Karen's doing, they will probably set up a study section.
Okay.
Because they don't traditionally have standing study sections that meet regularly. You only phage it. Okay. So the issues about knowing your study section is more if you're sending in what's called an unsolicited, where you have an idea And NIAID or whatever institute you're applying to hasn't said, hey, we're interested in that. You just think, well, I have an infectious disease related topic, I'm going to send it to NIAID. And in general, but there are program officers at NIAID in charge of 3 or 4 different pathogens. If you had a Pseudomonas phage cocktail, you would want to talk to the Pseudomonas program officer. Hopefully he or she would be able to tell you, go and say, I have this idea. They would give you advice, whether there is a funding announcement that might be appropriate or whether you will be most likely submitting an unsolicited R1, and then so the one thing I don't know is it's sort of inside baseball is sort of if you're doing an unsolicited R, how much influence can you and the program officer have in terms of picking the status that I mainly dealt with NIAID contracts, and that's the kind of inside baseball thing that I think that's why you should talk to your programs.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Well, this has been super enlightening. I don't know if this is the direction you thought we would take things, or if there's any things that you were hoping to share or reflect on, like we can kind of back up and zoom out and, looking back on the career and not just in nuts and bolts of how to get grants, but which I appreciate.
Sort of big picture, I think it's been an exciting time, and obviously cases like Tom's and other cases that have been reported just from the human side, and I think it affected you too. You hear cases like Mallory Smith where she didn't get paid fast enough, and you do kind of breaks your heart. It does break your heart, and you think, well, what can we do? And I imagine that's part of the reason, in addition to the fact that it was probably fun to live in Australia, that you went to Australia, because, a lot of us want to, for the most part, no one wants to see people die unnecessarily. But, a lot of us believe, and I certainly think that there are very few people who would look seriously at Tom Patterson's case and not think that he was probably saved by the phages. And certainly, as I will say, tell my wife, if I'm in that situation, I want you to move heaven and earth to find phages for me. So, obviously, we all want a situation where the situations where phages are where we think they're going to work, where they're going to be available. But we've discussed a little bit the economic challenges of all of that aren't trivial. Trying to balance the need for rigorous clinical trials that will really allow us to understand in the long run, I believe will make us in a better position to have more successful treatment cases, because we'll understand better how to dose the phages and what things are likely to be involved in successful and unsuccessful cases. You do clinical trials for at least 2 reasons. One is to show that they work, and the other is to get data as to how you can most, optimize the use of whatever therapeutic you're using. And I would say we don't. So, I wouldn't advocate just, getting a bunch of phages going and together and putting them into people whenever. Well, obviously you want to treat people, but you also, in the long run, you want to have cases where we know why and they did or didn't work, so that when someone is, when the future Tom Pattersons of the world, we've learned more. I love Chip Schooley, and Chip's wonderful, but he this isn't a criticism of when he. I don't know if you've ever asked Chip like how he decided how much phage to give Tom Patterson. It was basically, well, there's a limit of how much endotoxin someone can get.
Yeah.
And we added as much as we could without going over the endotoxin limit.
Yeah.
And no one would think, that's a great way to be doing medicine. You just like, okay. At some level you give the maximum tolerable dose and it does or doesn't work. But I'm sure, Chip's doing involved in clinical trials now because if there's another case like Tom Patterson, he would like to have a little bit more confidence that he's giving the right dose. I mean, with Tom, it was his friend, and Chip would have done the same thing even if it wasn't his friend.
Yep.
But, he didn't have time to figure all that stuff out.
Yeah.
He had to do something, and so he did what seemed to make the most sense. So trying to balance, forgetting the economics, but trying to balance the treating people who are in need with still allowing for us to understand better what are the optimal treatment regimens with phage is not trivial. And that's even leaving out all the economic challenges that we discussed ad nauseum earlier. If it was easy, it would be solved.
I really, really appreciate this. I think people will be really happy to hear just kind of chat about all this stuff. And I think it's encouraging that the phage field is not seen as this like never going to work sort of underdog anymore.